To the old lady who's going to need a new place to live soon, my daughter-in-law said, lifting her glass while the entire table watched me. For a moment, no one laughed. No one spoke. The clink of silverware stopped like someone had turned off a switch. I remember the balloons tied to the back of Lucas's chair, bright blue and silver, drifting gently under the restaurant lights. My grandson was turning 8 that afternoon. The private room at the Harbor View Grill smelled like grilled salmon, buttered rolls, and vanilla frosting. It should have been a happy memory. Instead, it was the moment I realized something had been quietly happening in my own family for months, and I had been the last one to see it. Ashley smiled after she said it. The way people do when they pretend a cruel joke is harmless. A few relatives gave uncomfortable chuckles. My son Daniel kept staring at the tablecloth, tracing the pattern with his finger like it had suddenly become fascinating. I lifted my glass too. My hand didn't shake. Not even a little. To Lucas, I said softly. The best grandson a grandmother could ask for. Lucas grinned, proud of the chocolate cake waiting at the end of the table. For him, the moment passed quickly. For me, it settled into the room like a quiet fog. I took a sip of iced tea and placed the glass back down carefully. Around me, conversations slowly restarted, though they sounded thinner now, like music playing from another room. The sunlight from the marina outside slipped through the tall windows and landed across the white tablecloth, catching the tiny crumbs of cornbread near my plate. I noticed small things when I was thinking. The way Ashley leaned close to Daniel and whispered something that made him nod. The way the restaurant manager walked in carrying a tray of birthday cupcakes and paused just long enough to sense the strange tension at our table before continuing on. It would have been easy to feel hurt in that moment. Easy to defend myself. Easy to ask Ashley exactly what she meant. But I had lived long enough to know that people rarely reveal their true intentions all at once. They show them in pieces. Small changes. Quiet decisions. And suddenly, as I watched the candles flicker in front of Lucas, several memories began to line up in my mind like puzzle pieces sliding into place. The new lock installed on the side door of the house 2 months ago. The bank envelope that had been opened before it reached my hands. The afternoon Daniel casually asked if I had ever thought about downsizing. At the time, each moment had seemed harmless. But sitting there at my grandson's birthday lunch, listening to Ashley's toast echo in the back of my mind, I realized those moments weren't separate at all. They were steps in a plan. And the person they expected to move quietly out of the way was me. I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't even let the smile fade from my face. Instead, I reached over and adjusted the little paper crown on Lucas's head before the candles were lit. The photographer the restaurant had hired snapped a picture right then. In the photo, everyone looks normal. Smiling. Celebrating. What the picture doesn't show is the decision I made at that exact moment. Because Ashley believed her little toast was the beginning of the end for me. She had no idea it was actually the beginning of something else entirely. I stayed until the very last candle burned down. Lucas blew them out with both hands cupped around the flame, his face glowing with excitement, while everyone clapped and cheered. For him, the afternoon was perfect. That was the only part that mattered to me in that moment. Ashley passed around slices of chocolate cake, laughing loudly with her sister while the rest of the family slowly relaxed back into conversation. If anyone was still thinking about her little toast, they did not say it out loud. People have a remarkable ability to pretend uncomfortable moments never happened, especially at family gatherings. I finished half of my coffee and watched the room the way I had started doing more often lately, quietly observing instead of participating. Daniel finally looked at me once, but only for a second. Then he reached for his phone and checked a message. The same thing he had been doing more and more over the past few months. The restaurant windows looked out over the marina, and a line of small white boats drifted gently against the docks. I remembered bringing Daniel there when he was a boy, back when Saturdays meant fishing poles and peanut butter. Sandwiches wrapped in foil. Those memories felt very far away now, like something from another person's life. After the cake was served, Ashley stood up again to hand Lucas his gifts. The boy tore through bright paper and ribbons while everyone leaned forward to see what was inside. New sneakers, a remote control truck, a stack of baseball cards. Ashley made sure to announce who had given each present, her voice cheerful and polished. When Lucas opened the box for me, he found the red bicycle I had ordered 2 weeks earlier. His eyes widened immediately. "Grandma, this is awesome," he said, jumping out of his chair to hug me. The room warmed for a moment after that. Even Ashley smiled, though it was a thin smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "That is very generous," she said, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket as if the gesture needed a comment. I nodded politely and told Lucas we would take it for a ride the next time he visited. Ashley did not respond to that. Instead, she gathered empty plates and stacked them neatly, already moving the afternoon toward its end. By the time the check arrived, people were putting on their coats and saying their goodbyes. Daniel gave me a brief hug near the doorway. It was quick, distracted. "Drive safe, Mom," he said. I told him I would. Ashley stood beside him, arms folded lightly across her purse strap. "We will talk soon," she added, though the way she said it sounded less like a promise and more like a quiet expectation. I stepped outside into the cool air of the marina parking lot and paused beside my car for a moment. The wind carried the smell of salt water and engine fuel from the boats nearby. I placed my keys in the ignition and sat there without starting the engine, replaying the afternoon in my mind. The toast, the silence, the careful glances between Ashley and Daniel. And then the memories returned again, clearer this time. The letter from the bank about a property review. The real estate flyer I had found folded on the kitchen counter last month. Daniel asking casual questions about whether I had considered selling the house, because it was a lot for one person. At the time I had smiled and changed the subject. Now I understood why those questions had appeared. Ashley believed the house already belonged to their future. She believed I would step aside quietly when the moment came. I started the car and looked once more at the restaurant entrance where my family was still laughing together under the awning. They thought the story had already been written. What they did not know was that I had spent 40 years making careful decisions, and the most important ones were never made out loud. I drove home slowly that afternoon, taking the long road along the marina instead of the highway. The sky had turned pale gray over the water, and the wind pushed small ripples across the surface like quiet wrinkles in glass. I had always liked that road because it gave me time to think. That day, I needed it more than usual. When I reached the house, the driveway looked exactly the way it had for the past 30 years. The same maple tree near the mailbox. The same porch light Daniel's father had installed one summer evening with a ladder that was slightly too short. I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, listening to the engine tick softly as it cooled. People assume that moments like the one at the restaurant bring immediate anger. For me, it was different. What I felt was clarity. Inside the house, everything was quiet. The hallway clock ticked steadily above the staircase. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water from the tap. The kitchen window looked out over the backyard where Daniel used to play catch when he was 10 years old. The grass had grown a little uneven this year, and I made a mental note to call the landscaping service again next week. Simple thoughts like that helped steady the mind. I opened the drawer near the refrigerator and took out the folder where I kept the house paperwork. Property tax statements. Insurance documents. Utility bills going back years. I had always been careful with records. My late husband used to say that quiet organization was the best kind of protection. As I flipped through the pages, the same memory from earlier returned again, stronger this time. 2 months ago, Daniel had visited on a Sunday afternoon. He had leaned against the kitchen counter exactly where I was standing now and asked a question that had seemed casual at the time. He wondered if I had ever thought about selling the house and moving somewhere smaller. He had said it gently, as if he were worried about me maintaining such a large place alone. I remember smiling and telling him the house still suited me just fine. What I had not told him was that the house had never been placed in his name or anyone else's. Years ago, after my husband passed away, I had met with a financial advisor who helped me restructure everything carefully. The deed, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio that paid the property taxes every year. I had made those decisions quietly because life had already taught me that circumstances change faster than people expect. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer. Then I walked through the living room, touching the back of the old leather chair where Daniel's father used to sit reading the newspaper every evening. The late sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor in long golden lines. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower started up, humming steadily in the distance. It was an ordinary neighborhood sound. Calm. Familiar. I stood by the window for a while, thinking about Ashley's smile during that toast and the way Daniel avoided meeting my eyes. They believed the house was already part of their future plans. They believed time was simply waiting for me to step aside. I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, already knowing what my next step would be in the morning. Some decisions do not require anger, only patience and the right moment. The next morning the house felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that settles over a place before the day fully begins. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen blinds and stretched across the table where Daniel used to do his homework when he was a teenager. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down in the same chair I had used for years, letting the warmth of the mug rest between my hands while the events of the previous afternoon returned to my mind with sharp clarity. Ashley's voice during that toast had not been loud, but it had carried across the table with a confidence that only comes from believing the outcome is already guaranteed. That kind of confidence does not appear overnight. It grows from conversations held behind closed doors and plans made quietly over time. I finished my coffee, washed the cup, and set it carefully on the drying rack beside the sink. Then I walked into the small office room near the front hallway where I kept my computer and the wooden filing cabinet that held decades of records. The cabinet drawer slid open with the familiar metal sound I had heard thousands of times before. Inside were folders labeled in neat handwriting, each one holding a different chapter of my life. Mortgage statements from years ago when the house was still new. Insurance policies. Bank summaries. I pulled out a thin folder near the back and placed it on the desk. Inside were the documents from the meeting I had attended shortly after my husband passed away. At the time, the financial advisor had explained something important in a calm and patient voice. He said that families often assume they understand how property and assets are arranged, but assumptions are not the same as facts. That day I had chosen to organize everything in a way that allowed me complete control over my home and my accounts for as long as I wished. I had never spoken about those details openly because there had never been a reason to. Until now. I turned on the computer and opened my email inbox. There was a message waiting from the property tax office confirming that next quarter's payment had already been processed through my investment account. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. Outside the window, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the street before stopping at the neighbor's house. The ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood continued without interruption. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just after 9 in the morning. The office I needed to visit opened at 9:30. I closed the email, shut down the computer, and returned the folder to the cabinet. As I locked the drawer, I thought again about the way Ashley had looked at me during that toast, certain that the future she imagined was already unfolding. Some people believe that patience is a sign of weakness. In truth, patience is simply the ability to wait until the right moment arrives. I took my coat from the hallway closet and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The maple leaves in the yard rustled softly as the wind moved through their branches. I locked the front door, walked to my car, and started the engine. The place I was driving to that morning was only 15 minutes away, but the conversation waiting there had the power to change everything Ashley thought she understood about this house and the woman who lived inside it. I arrived at the office building a few minutes early and remained in the car for a moment, watching the quiet street outside. The building was a modest brick structure with polished glass doors and a small brass sign beside the entrance listing several professional offices. I had visited this place before, though it had been a few years. Some conversations only happen when they truly need to. I stepped out of the car, straightened my coat, and walked inside. The reception area smelled faintly of paper and fresh coffee. A young receptionist looked up from her computer and greeted me with a polite smile. I told her my name, and she nodded as if she had been expecting me. "Mr. Caldwell will see you shortly," she said. I sat in one of the leather chairs near the window and folded my hands in my lap while the morning light reflected across the polished floor. Across the room, a shelf held framed photographs of sailboats and quiet coastal towns. They reminded me of the marina near the restaurant from the day before. And for a moment I could almost hear Lucas laughing again while he opened his birthday presents. The memory warmed me briefly before Ashley's voice returned to my mind, calm and confident during that toast. People who speak that way usually believe they are already standing on solid ground. A door opened down the hallway, and a familiar voice called my name. I stood and walked into the office where Mr. Caldwell was waiting behind a desk covered neatly with folders. He was a patient man with silver hair and the same steady expression I remembered from years earlier. "Margaret, it has been a while," he said warmly as he offered me a seat. I told him it had indeed been some time, and that I hoped he was doing well. After a few moments of polite conversation, the tone of the meeting shifted naturally toward the reason I had come. I explained that I wanted to review the structure of my estate and the ownership details of my home. Mr. Caldwell listened carefully without interrupting, occasionally making a small note on the yellow legal pad beside him. When I finished, he leaned back slightly in his chair and opened a file he had already prepared. "Everything you arranged previously is still exactly as you requested," he said calmly. "The property remains fully under your control, and no transfer can occur without your direct authorization." I nodded, unsurprised but reassured to hear it spoken aloud. He then asked if I wished to make any adjustments. I looked down at the documents spread across the desk, each page representing decisions made quietly over the years. Outside the office window, a delivery truck passed slowly along the street while the branches of a tall oak tree moved gently in the breeze. Life continued at its ordinary pace beyond that room. Inside, however, something important was beginning to take shape. "Yes," I said after a moment of thought. "I believe it is time to update a few things." Mr. Caldwell slid a new set of papers toward me and explained each change carefully, making sure every detail was clear. I listened without rushing. When the final page was placed before me, I picked up the pen and signed my name with the same steady hand that had lifted a glass at the restaurant the day before. The sound of the pen against the paper was quiet, almost unremarkable. Yet the decision behind that signature had the power to reshape expectations that had been forming quietly in someone else's mind. When the meeting ended, Mr. Caldwell walked me to the door and assured me that the documents would be processed immediately. I thanked him, stepped back into the hallway, and felt the calm certainty that comes from knowing a plan is now fully in motion. When I stepped back outside the building, the late morning sun had climbed higher into the sky, and the air carried that quiet warmth that often arrives near the end of spring along the coast. I walked slowly to my car, feeling the calm certainty that follows a decision once it has been placed firmly into motion. Inside the vehicle, I rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. The meeting had taken less than an hour, yet something important had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just carefully, the way most meaningful changes happen. As I pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto the main road, my mind returned briefly to the previous afternoon at the restaurant. The balloons, the laughter, Ashley raising her glass with that confident little smile. It was remarkable how easily people reveal what they believe about you when they think the future already belongs to them. I drove toward the grocery store a few blocks away, partly because the refrigerator at home needed restocking and partly because ordinary errands help keep life balanced even when larger plans are quietly unfolding. Inside the store, the familiar rhythm of shopping carts and soft music played over the speakers. I walked slowly through the aisles, selecting fresh vegetables, a carton of milk, and the bread Daniel used to like when he still visited for Sunday dinners. Habit is a powerful thing. Some habits remain long after circumstances change. At the checkout counter, the cashier greeted me politely and asked how my day had been. I told her it had been productive, which was true in more ways than she could possibly know. When I returned home, the house greeted me with the same peaceful stillness as the morning. I carried the groceries into the kitchen and placed them carefully into the refrigerator. Outside the window, the maple tree swayed gently in the breeze, scattering small shadows across the lawn. I poured another glass of water and sat at the table, letting the quiet settle around me. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed softly on the counter. The screen showed Daniel's name. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded casual, though there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. He asked how the birthday lunch had been and whether I had arrived home safely. I told him everything had been fine and that Lucas seemed very happy with his bicycle. There was a short pause after that, as if Daniel wanted to say something else but had not yet decided how to begin. Finally, he mentioned that he and Ashley had been talking about the future lately, and that perhaps we could all sit down sometime soon to discuss the house and long-term plans. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I simply told him that a family dinner sounded like a pleasant idea and that he should choose a day that worked for everyone. Daniel seemed relieved by my calm answer. We exchanged a few more polite words before ending the call. After I placed the phone back on the counter, I looked around the kitchen again. The same sunlight filled the room. The same quiet clock ticked above the doorway. Yet beneath that calm surface, A different current had begun to move forward. They believed the coming conversation would confirm everything they had been expecting. I stood from the table, rinsed my glass, and placed it beside the sink. Then I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that when that dinner finally happened, the story they thought they understood would begin to look very different. I spent the next few days exactly the way I always had, moving through the quiet routines of the house with the same steady rhythm that had filled these rooms for decades. Morning coffee at the kitchen table. A short walk down Maple Street before the afternoon heat arrived. The simple tasks that keep a home alive when you are the only one inside it. But beneath those routines, my thoughts remained very clear about the dinner Daniel had suggested. I knew Ashley would be there beside him, carefully prepared, certain that the conversation would finally move things forward in the direction she wanted. On Wednesday afternoon, Daniel called again. This time his voice carried a brighter tone, the sound people often use when they believe good news is approaching. He told me they had chosen Saturday evening for dinner and asked if I would mind hosting it here at the house. I told him that sounded perfectly fine. In fact, I said, it had been too long since everyone sat together around the same table. He agreed quickly. Ashley could be heard faintly in the background reminding him to ask whether 7 o'clock would work. I told him 7 o'clock was ideal. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the counter and stood for a moment looking around the kitchen. The same white cabinets Daniel's father had installed 25 years ago. The same oak table where birthdays and holidays had once filled the room with noise and laughter. Hosting the dinner here felt appropriate. After all, this house had always been the center of our family gatherings. On Friday morning, I stopped by the local market again and bought ingredients for a meal that Daniel used to love when he was younger. Roast chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes with butter, fresh green beans, and warm bread. Cooking had always been my way of welcoming people, even when the conversations around the table were not simple ones. By Saturday afternoon, the house smelled warm and familiar. Sunlight poured through the living room windows and stretched across the polished floor. I set the table carefully, placing each plate and glass in its usual place. There is something calming about preparing a table properly. It slows the mind and focuses attention on small details. The clock above the stove showed 6:30 when I finished placing the last napkin beside the plates. Outside, a car door closed in the driveway. A moment later, I heard Lucas's excited voice as he ran toward the front porch. I opened the door just as the doorbell rang. Lucas rushed inside first, smiling and asking if we could ride the red bicycle later. I told him we certainly could after dinner. Daniel followed behind him carrying a small bag of dessert from a bakery downtown. Ashley stepped in last, her eyes moving briefly across the hallway and living room as if she were quietly measuring the space again. She smiled politely when she saw me. "Everything smells wonderful," she said. I thanked her and invited them into the dining room. For a while the evening unfolded just like any other family dinner. Lucas talked about school and the baseball team he hoped to join next season. Daniel poured water into everyone's glasses. Ashley complimented the meal several times. Anyone listening from another room would have thought it was a completely ordinary evening. But beneath the polite conversation, I could feel the moment approaching. The moment Ashley and Daniel had been waiting for. Eventually Daniel cleared his throat gently and leaned forward in his chair. "Mom," he said carefully, "there is something Ashley and I have been meaning to discuss with you." I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and looked up at them with the same calm expression I had worn all week. "Of course," I said. "I believe this is exactly the conversation we should have tonight." Daniel's voice remained careful as he spoke. The way people sound when they believe they are approaching a delicate subject that will soon resolve itself in their favor. He explained that he and Ashley had been thinking about the future for a long time, especially now that Lucas was getting older and their family might eventually need more space. Ashley nodded gently beside him, folding her hands together on the table with the calm patience of someone who had already rehearsed this moment in her mind many times. Daniel continued by saying that the house had always meant a great deal to him because he grew up here, and that it would be wonderful if the property could remain within the family as the next generation settled down. I listened quietly while he spoke, occasionally taking a sip of water while the evening light from the dining room window stretched across the table. Lucas sat beside me finishing the last piece of bread, unaware that the adults around him were navigating something much more complicated than a simple family dinner. When Daniel finished speaking, Ashley added her part with a warm and encouraging tone. She said that perhaps it might be time for me to consider moving somewhere smaller and easier to maintain, maybe a comfortable condominium near the marina where many retirees lived. She described it as a thoughtful solution that would allow everyone to plan ahead without stress. I could see the confidence in her expression, the quiet belief that she had guided this conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. For a moment, I let the room fall silent. The clock in the kitchen ticked steadily behind us. Outside the window, the sky had turned a soft shade of blue as evening settled over the neighborhood. I placed my napkin neatly on the table and folded my hands together. I appreciate how much thought you have both given to the future, I said calmly. Daniel seemed relieved to hear those words, and Ashley's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if the hardest part of the conversation had already passed. What they did not yet realize was that the next part belonged to me. I stood from my chair and walked quietly into the hallway where a small wooden cabinet sat against the wall. Inside that cabinet was a folder I had prepared earlier in the week. I returned to the dining room, carrying it carefully, and placed it on the table beside Daniel's plate. Neither of them spoke as I opened the folder and slid several documents across the table toward them. The pages were neatly organized, each one stamped and signed with the same precise handwriting they had seen countless times on birthday cards and school permission slips when Daniel was younger. Daniel leaned forward first, reading the heading at the top of the first page. Ashley followed closely beside him, her earlier confidence fading slowly as her eyes moved across the lines of printed text. The documents explained very clearly that the ownership of the house had recently been placed into a protected family trust with specific conditions attached to it. Those conditions ensured that the property could never be sold or transferred by anyone except the person who currently lived there. In addition, a clause stated that the house would eventually pass to Lucas when he became an adult, guaranteeing that it remained part of the family without being controlled by anyone seeking to benefit from it prematurely. Daniel looked up from the paper with an expression I had not seen on his face in many years. Ashley remained silent, reading the final page twice before setting it back on the table. I took my seat again and lifted my glass of water. It is always wise to plan for the future, I said gently. I simply decided to do my planning a little earlier than expected. Daniel did not speak for several seconds after finishing the last page. He simply stared down at the document, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more comfortable if he waited long enough. Ashley sat very still beside him, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper, but the confident smile she had worn earlier in the evening had completely disappeared. The room felt unusually quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen and the soft scrape of Lucas pushing his chair back as he asked if he could be excused to watch television in the living room. I smiled at him and told him he could, reminding him that we would ride the bicycle afterward if there was still daylight. He ran off happily, the way children do when the adult world becomes too slow and serious for their attention. Once he disappeared down the hallway, Daniel finally lifted his eyes toward me. There was confusion there, but also something deeper that I recognized immediately. The quiet realization that the future he had been imagining no longer existed in the way he thought it did. Ashley cleared her throat softly and asked a careful question about the trust, wondering whether the arrangement could be modified later if circumstances changed. I answered gently that the structure had been designed very deliberately and that its purpose was to protect the home for the long term, especially for Lucas when he became older. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked around the dining room slowly, his eyes moving across the walls that had held his childhood photographs for decades. For a moment, he seemed less like the man sitting across from me and more like the boy who used to run through this house with muddy shoes after playing outside all afternoon. You planned all of this already, he said quietly. I nodded once. I have had many years to think about the future, I replied. Planning simply means making sure that the right things remain where they belong. Ashley said nothing after that. She folded her hands together again and stared down at the table while the meaning of the documents settled into the silence around us. Eventually, Daniel exhaled slowly and closed the folder, sliding it back toward me with a careful motion. I guess we did not understand how everything worked, he admitted. I placed the papers back into the folder and set it beside my chair. Many people assume they understand things that were never fully explained, I said calmly. That is why it is important to organize life before confusion appears. The evening gradually returned to a quieter rhythm after that. Dessert was served. Lucas came back into the dining room and proudly described a trick he had learned on his bicycle earlier that week. The conversation shifted to ordinary topics again, though the earlier certainty that had filled the room was gone. When Daniel and Ashley finally prepared to leave, I walked them to the front door just as I always had. The night air outside felt cool and steady as Daniel hugged me goodbye. Ashley offered a polite smile that looked smaller than before. I watched their car pull away down the street, the red glow of the tail lights fading slowly into the darkness. Then I closed the door, returned to the quiet kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. The house was peaceful again. The future was settled. And somewhere in the living room, my grandson was laughing at a television show, completely unaware that the home around him had just been secured for the life that still waited ahead.